The case of Madame Élisabeth serves as a grim milestone in gender history, precisely because it exposes the brutal double bind that trapped women during the French Revolution. It reveals a society that had constructed a fatal trap where two opposing female archetypes were destined for the same scaffold. On one side of this coin was Marie Antoinette, who was demonized as the sexual woman. She was viewed as dangerous because she allegedly used her sexuality to manipulate the king and, by extension, the state. In the eyes of the revolutionaries, she was too active, too visible, and too consuming. She represented a terrifying disorder that threatened to emasculate the nation, requiring her destruction to restore patriarchal control. In stark contrast stood Madame Élisabeth, who was targeted for embodying the asexual woman. Her danger lay not in what she did with men, but in the fact that she did not need them at all. She was too independent, too self-contained, and emotionally impenetrable. To a republic built on the concept of a fraternity of men, her self-sufficiency was read as an act of defiance. Her refusal to participate in the biological or sexual economy of the new state meant she represented resistance. But the fatal double bind that would later haunt the French Revolution was already casting its shadow decades earlier in England. Long before the guillotine, the Georgian court was its own kind of scaffold for those who didn't fit. And it was into this world of rigid masks that John Hervey was born in 1696. The chaotic, romantic, disastrous dynasty of the Stuart kings was staggering toward its end. By the time Hervey was a young man, the throne would be occupied by Germans, the Hanoverians, George I, and then George II. They were Protestants, they were practical, and they were profoundly un-English. They brought with them a court culture that was a strange hybrid, the stiff Lutheran formality of Hanover, clashing with the desperate desire to emulate the magnificent, decadent absolutism of Versailles over in France. London itself was a monstrosity of contradictions. It was the rising capital of a global trading empire, vast and wealthy. In the West End, new squares of elegant Georgian townhouses were springing up, monuments to order, reason, and classical proportion. Yet turn a corner, and you were in a medieval warren of filth, gin shops, and violence. There was no police force. The nights belonged to footpads and gangs. It was a society obsessed with surfaces, with politeness, with the right turn of phrase and the correct depth of a bow. Yet beneath this veneer of civilization beat a heart of shocking brutality. Public executions were mass entertainment. Blood sports like bear baiting and cockfighting drew cheering crowds of aristocrats and commoners alike. In this highly stratified world, heritage was everything, and John Hervey was born into a lineage famous for being peculiar. The Herveys of Ickworth in Suffolk were ancient, wealthy, and notoriously eccentric. A popular saying of the time, attributed to various wits, declared that humanity could be divided into three distinct species: men, women, and Herveys. They were known for their sharp intelligence, their artistic temperaments, their often fragile mental health, and a certain detachment from the normal rules of human behavior. John's father, John Hervey, 1st Earl of Bristol, was the living embodiment of this family character. The Earl was a man of immense pride and obsessive detail. He was a hypochondriac who chronicled his own ailments and those of his family in excruciating detail in his diaries. He was a demanding patriarch who expected absolute brilliance from his children, particularly his sons, yet he could also be suffocatingly affectionate. He was a dedicated Whig politician, a supporter of the Protestant succession and the power of Parliament, raising his family in the very engine room of British political power. Young John Hervey was the second son, not initially the heir. This position often grants a certain freedom in aristocratic families, a release from the crushing weight of expectation that falls on the firstborn. But the Hervey intensity spared no one. He was educated first at home, under the watchful, critical eye of his father, imbibing the classics, French literature, and the arts of rhetoric. He was a beautiful child. Portraits from his early youth show a face of almost startling delicacy, large, liquid eyes, a perfectly shaped nose, a mouth that seemed ready to smile or sneer with equal ease. There was a softness to his features that some already marked as effeminate, but in a young boy of high birth, this was often seen as a mark of refinement, a sign that he was far removed from the coarse, red-faced squires of the countryside. He was sent to Westminster School, the crucible of the British ruling class, a rough, tough environment where the sons of dukes and earls learned Latin verbs and brutal social hierarchies in equal measure. From there, he went to Clare College, Cambridge. At Cambridge, the patterns of his future life began to emerge. He was brilliant, soaking up knowledge with an ease that made others jealous. He could write Latin verse as easily as he wrote English prose. He developed a reputation as a wit, someone whose conversation glittered, whose retorts were instantaneous and cutting. But it was also at Cambridge that the shadow of illness first began to lengthen over his life. The fits began to appear more regularly. We cannot be certain today what they were. Temporal lobe epilepsy is a strong modern hypothesis. But to the 18th century mind, they were terrifying. A seizure was a moment of chaos, a loss of the self-control that was the hallmark of a gentleman. It was viewed by some as a physical manifestation of a weak moral constitution, or even a divine disfavor. Hervey learned early on the agonizing necessity of hiding his weakness. He learned to sense the aura that preceded a seizure, the strange smells or visual disturbances that gave him just enough time to retreat to his rooms, to lock the door, to endure the electrical storm in his brain in private, away from the prying eyes of rivals who would use his infirmity against him. Despite these hidden struggles, by the time he came down from Cambridge and entered London society in the late 1710s, John Hervey was a golden youth. He was handsome, he was high-born, and he was devastatingly charming. He moved easily through the drawing rooms and the balls, a creature of silk and wit. It was in this early glittering phase of his life that he met Mary Lepel. Mary Lepel was, by universal acclaim, one of the most extraordinary women of her generation. She was a maid of honor to Caroline, then the Princess of Wales. In the highly charged, sexually competitive atmosphere of the prince's court, Mary stood out not just for her beauty, which was considerable, but for her mind. She was sharp, intellectually curious, and possessed a dry, self-deprecating sense of humor that matched Hervey's own. She was not a passive ornament. She was a player in the great game of court society. Alexander Pope, before he turned his poison pen against Hervey, adored Mary Lepel, praising her sense and spirit. The courtship between John Hervey and Mary Lepel was the talk of the town. They seemed a perfect match, two creatures of supreme artificiality and supreme intelligence, finding a mirror in each other. But why did they marry? For Mary, Hervey was a brilliant catch, the son of an earl with bright prospects. For Hervey, the motivations were likely more complex. In an age where a man's status was intrinsically tied to his ability to propagate his line and head a household, marriage was an absolute necessity. To remain a bachelor past a certain age was to invite suspicion, to be labeled eccentric at best and a sodomite at worst. Hervey genuinely liked women. He enjoyed their company, their conversation, and, as his later life would prove, their beds. He was not exclusively homosexual in the modern sense of the word. His desires were fluid, encompassing beauty and intellectual connection wherever he found it. He admired Mary immensely. He saw in her a partner, an intellectual equal, someone with whom he could navigate the treacherous waters of society. They married in 1720. It was a union that would produce 8 children in rapid succession, a testament to a certain kind of conjugal vigor. To the outside world, they were the golden couple of the Whig aristocracy. They were young, beautiful, rich, and connected. They held court in their own London house, surrounded by poets, politicians, and philosophers. Hervey's letters to Mary in these early years are full of affectionate banter, intimate jokes, and a genuine, deeply rooted fondness. He relied on her judgment, updated her on political intrigues when they were apart, and trusted her implicitly. Yet even in these early sunlit years of marriage, there were shadows. Hervey's health was a constant nagging worry. The smallpox had struck, leaving its permanent disfigurement, the first major blow to his vanity and his physical self-confidence. The seizures were an ever-present threat. And beneath the surface of this seemingly perfect conventional marriage, Hervey's deeper, more dangerous desires were beginning to stir. The 18th century was a period of intense romantic friendships between men, connections that were expressed in language of passionate devotion that modern ears might immediately interpret as sexual. Men wrote to each other of their ardent love, their throbbing hearts, at the thought of reunion. Much of this was the convention of the age, a performance of sensibility, but for Hervey, it was more than performance. He lived in a London that possessed a secret geography. While the court and the coffee houses were the domain of respectable masculinity, there existed another world in the shadows, the molly houses. These were taverns and private back rooms, often in the grittier parts of the city like Holborn or around Covent Garden. Here, men met other men. They drank gin, they danced, and in many of them they enacted elaborate rituals of gender inversion. Men would adopt female names, call each other sisters, and sometimes enact mock marriages and births. It was a subculture of desperate fun and immense risk. The molly houses were frequently raided by the Society for the Reformation of Manners, a group of moral vigilantes who worked with constables to entrap and arrest sodomites. The penalty, under the Buggery Act of 1533, was death by hanging. While aristocratic status offered some protection, a lord was unlikely to be dragged out of a cheap tavern in Cheapside. The threat of scandal was enormous. A ruined reputation was a social death, almost as feared as physical death. There is no definitive proof that the young Lord Hervey visited molly houses. His world was higher, more refined, protected by the thick walls of palaces and country estates. But his nature tuned him into this frequency. He was acutely aware of the fluidity of gender because he felt it within himself. He chafed against the rigid expectations of the robust, hunting, shooting, winching English masculinity. He found it boorish and dull. He preferred the company of women, the softness of silk, the sharp rapier thrust of wit over the blunt trauma of physical confrontation. He was discovering that he was different, and in the 1720s, that discovery was a dangerous thing. The crucial turning point, the moment the mass began to harden and the true trajectory of his heart was revealed, came not in London, but abroad. In 1723, John Hervey's older brother, Car Hervey, died. Suddenly, John was no longer just the brilliant second son. He was Lord Hervey, the heir to the earldom of Bristol. The pressure intensified instantly. His father's demands became more suffocating. The expectations of his political party, the Whigs, grew heavier. His health buckled under the strain. His doctors, following the standard wisdom of the day, prescribed a change of air. And so Hervey set out on that great rite of passage for the 18th century gentleman, the Grand Tour. He headed south toward the sun and the classical ruins of Italy, toward a destiny he could not have foreseen. He was leaving behind his wife, his growing family, and his established life. He was traveling toward a meeting that would redefine his entire existence, a collision with a man who would become the sun around which Hervey's emotional world revolved for the next decade. He was traveling toward Stephen Fox. As the carriage rattled away from the gray, suffocating expectations of the British aristocracy, Hervey was not merely crossing a geographical border. He was crossing a threshold of the soul. He was leaving behind the rigid roles of husband and courtier to enter a landscape that promised a dangerous new freedom. The journey south was a shedding of skin, a preparation for an encounter that would shatter his understanding of love and self. When the Alps finally gave way to the warmth of the Mediterranean, Hervey was no longer just a tourist. He was a man awakening from a long, cold sleep, ready to step onto a stage that would define the rest of his life. The air of Italy in the late 1720s was a balm to a man like John Hervey, a stark and welcome contrast to the coal smoke and damp fogs of London. He had crossed the Alps, a journey of terrifying sublimity, where carriages were often dismantled and carried by mules over precipitous tracks, to descend into the sun-drenched plains of the south. For Hervey, this was not merely a holiday. It was a convalescence and an escape. In the warm light of Florence and Rome, the rigid armor he wore in England could be loosened, if only slightly. It was here, amidst the crumbling grandeur of the Roman Empire and the vibrant, operatic chaos of Italian street life, that the most defining relationship of his life truly blossomed. He was traveling with Stephen Fox. Stephen Fox was, in many ways, the perfect foil to John Hervey. Born in 1704, he was 8 years Hervey's junior. Where Hervey was sharp, angular, and radiantly, almost painfully intellectual, Fox was softer, rounder in character, and possessed of a steady dog-like devotion. He was wealthy, the son of a paymaster of the forces, and firmly embedded in the Whig aristocracy, but he lacked Hervey's dangerous edge. Fox was not a man to initiate a duel or craft a poisonous satire. He was a man to build a home, to manage an estate, and to love with a profound, unironic sincerity. If Hervey was the mercurial element of Quicksilver, Fox was the earth that grounded him. In the isolation of their travels, away from the prying eyes of the British court and the demands of Hervey's growing family, their friendship deepened into something that defied the easy categorizations of their time, or indeed of ours. They spent their days exploring the ruins of antiquity, standing before the statues of emperors and gods, perhaps seeing in the marble forms of Hadrian and Antinous a historical precedent for their own affinity. The 18th century Grand Tour was a homosocial environment. Young men traveled together, slept in the same inns, often in the same beds due to overcrowding or custom, and shared an intimacy that was accepted as part of the education of a gentleman. But the bond between Hervey and Fox went far beyond the camaraderie of travel companions. It became a spiritual and emotional marriage. Hervey, who often felt isolated by his own brilliance and his physical suffering, found in Fox a safe harbor. Fox did not judge the fits. He did not recoil from the sickness. He offered a steady hand and an adoration that fed Hervey's starving ego. When they returned to England, they did not sever this bond. Instead, they integrated it into the very structure of their lives. They spent long periods living together, often at the Fox family estate, in Redlinch, Somerset. What is truly remarkable and what speaks to the sophisticated, if somewhat bizarre, social arrangements of the Georgian aristocracy is the reaction of Hervey's wife, Mary. Far from being the jealous, scorned woman, Mary Lepel accepted Stephen Fox not just as her husband's friend, but as a second partner in their domestic life. She wrote to him with genuine affection, playfully acknowledging his primacy in her husband's heart. In one letter, she famously told Fox that she was content to be his proxy in bed with Hervey when Fox could not be there. It was a triangular arrangement of startling modernity, a ménage à trois of the heart, if not always of the body, held together by mutual intelligence and a shared devotion to the fragile, brilliant man at its center. However, the idyll of Redlinch could not last forever. The gravitational pull of London and ambition was too strong. By 1730, the political landscape of Britain was shifting, and Hervey was ready to take his place on the stage. The man who returned from Italy was tougher, more focused, and ready to weaponize his charm. He aligned himself decisively with Sir Robert Walpole, the First Lord of the Treasury, and the man who is historically recognized as Britain's first Prime Minister. Walpole was a colossus, a fat, coarse, brilliant political operator who ran the country like a business, buying votes, managing the king, and keeping the peace. He needed men like Hervey, men with the breeding and the access to the royal inner circle that Walpole, a Norfolk squire at heart, sometimes lacked. In 1730, Hervey was appointed vice-chamberlain to the king's household. It was a position of immense prestige and lethal proximity. It meant he was no longer an outsider looking in. He was now a fixture of the court, required to be in attendance at the palaces of St. James, Kensington, and Hampton Court. His duties were ostensibly ceremonial, carrying messages, organizing royal audiences, attending to the family, but in reality he was a spy, a diplomat, and a confidant. And the person he was destined to captivate was not the boorish, short-tempered King George II, but his wife, the formidable Queen Caroline of Ansbach. Queen Caroline was, without doubt, the most intelligent individual to sit on the British throne since Elizabeth I. She was a woman of vast intellectual appetites, corresponding with the philosopher Leibniz, debating theology, and steering the ship of state while letting her husband believe he was the captain. She was trapped in a marriage to a man who was often petty, unfaithful, and boring, a man who preferred military parades to metaphysical debates. When John Hervey entered her orbit, it was like a spark hitting dry tinder. She saw past the painted face and the foppish clothes. She saw a mind that matched her own. Hervey became the Queen's Lord Fanny, her pet, her child, and her political eyes and ears. Their relationship was conducted in the private, claustrophobic world of the Queen's dressing room. Every morning, while the Queen performed her own toilette, having her hair dressed, her heavy German makeup applied, Hervey would be there. It was a space of extraordinary intimacy. He would lean against the chimney-piece, entertaining her with the scandalous gossip of the night before, dissecting the motives of her enemies, and subtly influencing her decisions, which she would then whisper into the king's ear later that night. They were united by a shared cynicism and a shared physical suffering. Caroline, too, was hiding a secret, a painful umbilical hernia and later gout, which she concealed with stoic fortitude. They were two invalids ruling an empire from a boudoir, masking their pain with wit and powder. But this elevation came at a terrible price. The higher Hervey rose in the Queen's favor, the more he became a target. The court of George II was a snake pit, divided violently between the King's party and the party of his son Frederick, Prince of Wales. It was a tradition in the Hanoverian dynasty for the heir to hate the father, and Frederick loathed his parents with a burning intensity. Initially, Hervey and Frederick had been friends. They had shared mistresses, gambled together, and engaged in the rough camaraderie of young bucks. But as Hervey aligned himself with the Queen and Walpole, the parents' faction, Frederick viewed it as the ultimate betrayal. The friendship curdled into a hatred that was obsessive and venomous. Frederick, the Prince of Wales, was a man of limited intelligence but vast entitlement. He could not attack his mother directly, nor could he easily destroy Walpole. So he turned his sights on the white monkey, the painted toad, Lord Hervey. He began to sponsor writers and poets to attack Hervey in print. The press of 1730s London was a free-for-all of libel and satire, and Hervey was the perfect victim. His effeminacy, his makeup, his ambiguous relationship with Stephen Fox, all of it, was grist for the mill. He was caricatured in cartoons, mocked in broadsheets, and whispered about in the coffee houses. They called him a catamite, a term for a boy kept for prying sexual purposes. They questioned the paternity of his children. They stripped him naked in the public square of opinion. Yet Hervey did not crumble. He possessed a spine of steel beneath the silk. He fought back with his own pen, writing political pamphlets defending the government that were masterpieces of logical argumentation. He advised the Queen on how to handle her rebellious son, often scripting the very scenes that played out between the royals. He was living a double life of exhausting proportions. By day, he was the vice-chamberlain, standing for hours in his high heels, bowing, smiling, whispering, ignoring the sneers of the prince's friends. By night he would return to his chambers, wash off the lead paint, take his laudanum to quiet the screaming nerves in his stomach, and write his memoirs. These memoirs are the secret masterwork of his life. He wrote them not for publication in his lifetime. He knew they were far too dangerous for that, but for posterity. In them, he stripped the court of its glamour. He described the king not as a majestic monarch, but as a strutting little man who bored everyone to tears. He described the court ceremonies not as dignified rituals, but as empty pageants performed by hypocrites. And he recorded with a mix of pride and melancholy his own role in it all. He knew he was a creature of the shadows, a man who could never be the king, never be the prime minister, but who whispered the words that the powerful spoke. The strain of this life began to tell on his relationship with Stephen Fox. Fox, the steady, loving spaniel, was struggling with the world Hervey now inhabited. Fox was a simple Whig MP. He was not a court creature. He found the duplicity of the palace exhausting. Moreover, the social pressure on Fox to marry and produce an heir was becoming irresistible. He was nearing 30, wealthy, and the last of his line. Hervey, with a selfishness born of fear, tried to delay this. He wanted to keep Fox as his emotional reserve, his safe place. The letters from this period are heart-wrenching. Hervey writes of his jealousy, his fear of abandonment. He berates Fox for not writing enough, for looking at women, for drifting away. "I have no pleasure but in you," Hervey wrote, a confession of terrifying vulnerability from a man who seemingly had the world at his feet. But the 18th century had its rules, and even a love as deep as theirs could not hold back the tide of dynastic duty. Stephen Fox began to court a young heiress named Elizabeth Horner. The news struck Hervey like a physical blow. It was the beginning of a slow, painful fracture. He could not stop it, and perhaps in his rational mind, he knew he shouldn't. But emotionally, it was a betrayal of the marriage they had forged under the Italian sun. Hervey was being left behind in his gilded cage, painted and powdered, while Fox was moving on to the respectable sunlit world of country squires and legitimate children. It was in this atmosphere of emotional turbulence that the Sporus attack occurred. Alexander Pope was the literary giant of the age, a man whose rhyming couplets could destroy a reputation forever. Pope had once been friendly with Hervey and Mary Lapel, but a mixture of political differences and personal slights had turned him into an enemy. When Pope published his epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot in 1735, the portrait of Sporus was the nuclear option. It didn't just mock Hervey, it dehumanized him. By calling him a bug with gilded wings, Pope was tapping into a deep primal revulsion against the unnatural. He was painting Hervey as a monster, a biological error. The public humiliation was total. Hervey was a man who prided himself on his control, on his mask. Pope had ripped the mask off and shown the world a caricature of corruption. Most men would have retreated to their country estates and never shown their faces again. Hervey did the opposite. He went to court the next day, dressed more impeccably than ever, his head held high. He ignored the whispers. He stared down his enemies. He demonstrated a type of courage that the beef-eating Englishman could barely comprehend, the courage of the outcast who refuses to be ashamed. But inside, the damage was catastrophic. The stress triggered more frequent seizures. The need for laudanum increased. He was winning the political battles, helping Walpole survive crisis after crisis, but he was losing the war for his own soul. As the 1730s ground on, a new tragedy approached, one that would shake the very foundations of Hervey's power. Queen Caroline, the one person who truly understood him, the woman who was his political mother and his intellectual twin, was dying. Her hernia, long ignored and hidden out of a sense of duty and vanity, had strangulated. The doctors of the 18th century, with their crude tools and lack of anesthesia, began their torturous interventions. Hervey was there through it all. He practically lived in the Queen's antechamber during her final agonizing days in 1737. He watched the woman who held the kingdom together writhe in pain. He watched the king weep loudly and performatively, promising the dying queen he would never marry again, only take mistresses, a remark that even in her death throes caused Caroline to urge him to marry. When Caroline died, the light went out of the palace for Hervey. He had lost his protector. He was now alone with a king who tolerated him but did not love him, and a Prince of Wales who wanted him dead. The political wolves began to circle. Walpole's power was waning, chipped away by the opposition and the clamor for war with Spain. Hervey, as Walpole's creature, was vulnerable. The Sporus insults were revived. The loneliness of his private life, with Fox now married and distant, became a cavernous void. Yet there was one final act to play. Hervey was not done. He was determined to secure his legacy and his family's future before his own broken body gave out. By 1740, as Walpole's hegemony began to fracture, Hervey seized his moment. In an act of sheer political brute force, he leveraged every royal secret he held to grasp the prize he had long coveted, the Lord Privy Seal. It was the audacious final charge of a man who refused to be cast aside. By all conventional logic, Hervey should have been excluded. He was too controversial, too hated by the opposition, and too physically frail. The Duke of Newcastle, a nervous, fretful man who controlled the vast patronage networks of the Whig Party, detested Hervey. Newcastle viewed Hervey as a venomous serpent in the bosom of the government, a man who had too much influence over the king and whose scandalous reputation tainted them all. Newcastle pleaded with Walpole to block the appointment, but Hervey held a card that no one else possessed. He knew the king's mind better than the king himself. He knew the intimate, sordid details of the royal family's feuds. He had been the keeper of Queen Caroline's secrets, and in her absence he had made himself the indispensable crutch for the grieving, grumpy George II. Hervey effectively bullied his way into the cabinet. He made it clear that to deny him the seal would be to make an enemy of a man who wrote everything down, a man whose pen was sharper than any sword. When Hervey finally took the seal of office, pressing the heavy wax that authenticated the monarch's will, it was a moment of supreme triumph and supreme irony. He had reached the summit of British political life just as the ground was beginning to crumble beneath his feet. He was now a cabinet minister, one of the handful of men who ran the empire. He sat at the long table in the cockpit, the government offices at Whitehall, surrounded by men who were ostensibly his colleagues, but who watched him with eyes full of suspicion. Imagine the scene, a room filled with heavy, periwigged men in dark velvet, men of beef and port, red-faced and boisterous, and among them sits Hervey. He is a spectral figure in this assembly. His face is a mask of white lead, his cheeks daubed with rouge, his body wrapped in silk to hide his emaciation. He sips his medicinal broth while they drink their claret. When he speaks, his voice is low, precise, and dripping with a sarcasm that cuts through their bluster. He is the alien in the room, the third sex presiding over the affairs of state. His tenure as Lord Privy Seal was marked by a grim determination to hold back the tide. The war with Spain, which he had opposed because he knew it would be costly and pointless, was going badly. The opposition, led by the Patriots, a coalition of disaffected Whigs and Tories, was smelling blood. They were hunting Walpole, the great beast of British politics. And because Hervey was Walpole's creature, they were hunting him too. The attacks in the press intensified. They no longer just mocked his sexuality. They mocked his physical decay. They painted him as a rotting corpse propped up by corruption. The white ceruse, once his shield against a judgmental world, had become his silent executioner. 20 years of painting his face had left a toxic harvest, receding blue gums, a failing nervous system, and a body slowly liquefying behind a mask of lead. He was a man performing a miracle of will, ruling an empire while his own biology was under chemical siege. His nervous system was collapsing. The seizures were now almost continuous. The doctors, helpless, could only offer more opium, more bleeding, more useless tortures. His father, the old Earl of Bristol, watched this decline with a mixture of horror and grief. The Earl was a survivor, a man who would outlive almost all his children. He had been hard on John, critical and demanding, but he loved him with a fierce, possessive pride. Seeing his brilliant, beautiful son reduced to a skeleton was the tragedy of the Earl's old age. He sat by Hervey's bedside, watching the light fade from those large, intelligent eyes. In those final weeks, the mask finally came off. Hervey was too weak to apply the white lead. The rouge lay untouched in its pot. The wig was set aside. For the first time in 20 years, the true face of John Hervey was visible to the world, scarred, pale, wasted, but undeniably human. The Sporus that Pope had mocked, the Lord Fanny that the mob had jeered, stripped away his defenses. What remained was a man who had loved too much, felt too deeply, and seen too clearly. He had navigated a world that wanted him dead, and he had survived longer and risen higher than anyone could have predicted. On August 5th, 1743, the struggle ended. Lord John Hervey died at the age of 46. The silence that fell over St. James's Square was heavy. The intellectual engine of the court had stopped. The gossip, the wit, the scandal, it all evaporated into the summer air. But the story does not end with his death. In fact, in many ways, the death of John Hervey was merely the intermission in a much longer drama, for he left behind him a legacy that was a ticking time bomb. He left a family that carried his blood and his eccentricities. He left a wife, Mary Lepel, who had to navigate the world as the widow of the most notorious man in England. And he left the box, the locked chest, containing his memoirs, which sat in the library at Ickworth, waiting for a time when the world might be ready to hear the voice of the third sex. The immediate aftermath of his death was a scramble to control the narrative. The king breathed a sigh of relief. The man who knew too much was gone. The Duke of Newcastle rubbed his hands. The serpent was slain. Alexander Pope, whose health was also failing, perhaps felt a flicker of satisfaction that his victim had predeceased him. But they underestimated the power of the ghost. Hervey's influence had seeped into the groundwater of the Georgian era. He had shaped the politics of the realm. He had defined the aesthetic of the court, and he had lived a life that quietly challenged every norm of gender and sexuality. As they prepared to bury him in the family vault at Ickworth, beneath the flat Suffolk fields, the question hung in the air: was John Hervey a villain, a victim, or a pioneer? Was he the monster Pope described, or was he a martyr to a society that had no place for him? To answer that, we must look at what happened next. We must look at the survival of his family, the strange fate of his writings, and the long shadow he cast over the 18th century. We must look at how the amphibious thing refused to stay buried. With the amphibious thing finally expelled from the halls of power, the narrative seemed to pause, holding its breath for the inevitable conclusion of his physical decline. But death, for John Hervey, was not an exit. It was merely a change of state. As his body failed, the machinery of his legacy began to turn, grinding into motion a sequence of events driven by family pride and fear that would protect, obscure, and ultimately resurrect his name. The man was gone, but the ghost was just beginning its long, restless haunting of Ickworth House. The silence that descended upon Ickworth House in the late summer of 1743 was not merely the quiet of mourning. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a secret being buried. The body of John Hervey, stripped of its velvet finery, its powdered wig, and its mask of white lead, was lowered into the family vault beneath the small flint-knapped church that stood within the parkland. It was a modest end for a man who had lived so loudly. His father, the old Earl of Bristol, stood at the graveside, a figure carved from grief and granite. He had outlived his favorite son, the pride of his life, and now he was left with the wreckage of a dynasty that was as brilliant as it was unstable. The Earl knew as the earth fell upon the coffin that he was burying more than a man. He was burying a scandal that had threatened to consume the British monarchy. In London, the reaction to Hervey's death was a collective exhale of relief. The king, George II, reportedly said little, but his actions spoke volumes. With Hervey gone, the last uncomfortable reminder of Queen Caroline's dominance was removed. The king was free to be his own man, obstinate, militaristic, and dull, without the sharp, mocking intelligence of Lord Fanny whispering in his ear. The Duke of Newcastle and the other Whig grandees, who had feared Hervey's pen as much as his politics, slept sounder in their beds. They believed the Hervey problem was solved. They believed that without his physical presence, the stories of his fluid sexuality, his drug addiction, and his intimate machinations would fade into the fog of history. They were wrong. They had forgotten that John Hervey was a writer, and a writer is never truly dead as long as his words survive. The burden of this survival fell upon his widow, Mary Lepel. If John Hervey was the tragedy of the Georgian court, Mary was its triumph of endurance. She was 43 years old when he died, still beautiful, still possessed of that razor-sharp wit that had first attracted him. She found herself in a precarious position. She was the widow of the most reviled man in England, the Sporus of Pope's satire. She had 8 children to launch into a society that viewed their bloodline with deep suspicion. A lesser woman might have retreated to the country and hidden her face. Mary did the opposite. She constructed a life of impeccable respectability and intellectual glamour that served as a shield for her family. She traveled to France, a country she had always loved and whose language she spoke better than most natives. In the salons of Paris, she was not the widow of a monster. She was Milady Hervey, a woman of culture and letters. She corresponded with the great minds of the Enlightenment, including Voltaire. She curated a persona of dignity that slowly, layer by layer, began to rehabilitate the Hervey name. Yet she remained fiercely loyal to John's memory. She never remarried. In her private letters, she spoke of him with a tenderness that defied the public narrative. She knew the man beneath the paint, the suffering, the brilliance, the capacity for love, and she refused to let the world reduce him to a caricature. However, she was also a pragmatist. She knew that for her sons to succeed, the more scandalous aspects of their father's life had to be suppressed. This led to the great silence regarding the memoirs. The manuscript that Hervey had labored over in his final years, the explosive day-by-day account of the court's corruption, was now the property of the family. The old Earl of Bristol, Hervey's father, read it. He was shocked. He saw the king portrayed as a fool, the prince as a scoundrel, and the entire political class as a nest of vipers. He saw his son's own naked ambition and his bitter resentments laid bare. The Earl knew that publishing this in 1743 would be an act of treason. It would destroy the family's standing forever. And so the decision was made. The manuscript was not destroyed. The Herveys were too proud of their own genius to burn it, but it was locked away. It was placed in a chest at Ickworth, under strict instructions that it was not to be opened. It became the family's dark nuclear secret, a radioactive text that sat in the library, gathering dust while the world outside changed. While the father's words were silenced, his blood could not be contained. The Hervey eccentricity did not die with John. It merely mutated. The generation that followed him, the children of the third sex, would prove to be just as wild, just as brilliant, and just as incapable of following the rules as their father. They were living proof of the adage, the world consists of men, women, and Herveys. The eldest son, George, who eventually became the second Earl of Bristol, was a man of distinct aloofness. He followed a military and diplomatic career, serving as Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. He was unmarried, distant, and carried himself with a haughty reserve that many saw as a shadow of his father's arrogance, though without the flamboyance. But it was the younger sons, Augustus and Frederick, who truly inherited the chaotic energy of Lord John Hervey. Augustus Hervey, the English Casanova, was a figure who seemed to have stepped out of a picaresque novel. He joined the Navy, finding in the rough, all-male world of the sea a different kind of freedom than his father had found in the court. He was brave, reckless, and insatiable. His journals, which rival his father's in candor, if not in political insight, catalog a life of endless conquests. He seduced women in every port, from Lisbon to Jamaica. But his greatest scandal was his secret marriage to Elizabeth Chudleigh. Elizabeth was the most notorious woman of the age, a beauty who once attended a masquerade ball at Somerset House dressed as Iphigenia, wearing a diaphanous gown so sheer that, as one observer noted, she was naked to the waist and nearly so below. Augustus married her in a secret, candlelit ceremony in a country church, a union born of impulsive lust. They hated each other almost immediately. They separated, kept the marriage secret, and lived their own lives. Years later, when Elizabeth tried to marry the Duke of Kingston, the secret came out. It resulted in the trial of the century for bigamy, a spectacle that captivated London, just as the Sporus scandal had done decades earlier. Augustus, far from being shamed, seemed to enjoy the notoriety. He inherited the earldom late in life, becoming the third Earl of Bristol, and spent his final years as a gout-ridden, cynical old admiral, telling stories of his conquests and looking remarkably like the portraits of his father. The same heavy-lidded eyes, the same sensual mouth, the same defiance. Then there was Frederick Hervey, who became the fourth Earl of Bristol. If John Hervey was the third sex, Frederick was something else entirely, perhaps a fourth species. He entered the church and became the Bishop of Derry in Ireland. A bishop is supposed to be a figure of piety and restraint. Frederick was a figure of opulent absurdity. He was immensely wealthy and spent his fortune on art, geology, and building mania. He constructed vast classical palaces in Ireland, downhill in Ballyscullion, filling them with treasures looted from Italy. He traveled Europe in a carriage equipped with a kitchen and a bed, dressed in purple velvet breeches and a broad-brimmed white hat with gold tassels. He was known to have organized a curry race for the local Anglican curates, offering the fattest living in his diocese to the winner. Frederick Hervey was a man who, like his father, refused to be categorized. He was a champion of Catholic emancipation and religious tolerance in Ireland, a radical position for an Anglican bishop. He was a patron of the arts and a geologist who risked his life climbing Vesuvius during an eruption. He was a Hervey in the purest sense, brilliant, mad, and utterly indifferent to public opinion. In him, the toxic, introverted eccentricity of John Hervey exploded outward into a grand, extroverted performance. The father had painted his face to hide. The son painted the landscape with his monuments to demand attention. Meanwhile, the ghost of Lord John Hervey continued to haunt the literary and political imagination of England. Throughout the mid-18th century, as the novel became the dominant art form, characters resembling Hervey began to appear, effeminate aristocrats, dangerous seducers, men of feeling who were viewed with suspicion. The macaroni fashion of the 1760s and 70s, where young men wore towering wigs, bright colors, and carried spyglasses, was in many ways a mass-market adoption of the style Hervey had pioneered. But where Hervey's style was a personal armor against a hostile world, the macaronis were often dismissed as mere fashion victims. Hervey remained the original, the dark archetype. The suppression of his memoirs meant that for decades the only image the public had of him was Alexander Pope's Sporus. This was a tragedy of reputation. Without his own voice to defend himself, Hervey was frozen in amber as the villain. He was the toad, the bug, the familiar. Historians of the late 18th century, writing the chronicles of the glorious rise of the British Empire, had no place for a man like Hervey. He didn't fit the narrative of robust masculine imperialism. He was an embarrassment, a relic of a corrupt, court-centered past that the new, industrializing Britain wanted to forget. He was erased from the serious histories and relegated to the footnotes of scandal. But silence has a way of amplifying curiosity. In the library at Ickworth, the box containing the memoirs sat like a dormant volcano. The manuscript passed from earl to earl. Each generation faced the dilemma: destroy it and erase the shame, or keep it and preserve the genius. To their eternal credit, the Herveys, despite their madness, respected intellect above all else. They knew that what lay in that box was a masterpiece. They knew it was the finest political memoir in the English language. They couldn't bring themselves to burn it. They simply waited. They waited for a time when the world might be less judgmental, or perhaps just distant enough to view the scandals of George II's court as history rather than treason. As the 18th century bled into the 19th, the cultural climate shifted again. The Regency era brought a brief return to debauchery and wit, a time when a figure like Hervey might have been understood, but it was quickly followed by the crushing weight of Victorianism. The 19th century, with its rigid morality, its obsession with manliness and muscular Christianity, was the worst possible environment for John Hervey. To the Victorians, Hervey was not just a villain, he was a pathogen. His effeminacy, his bisexuality, his skepticism, these were diseases that threatened the moral health of the nation. When the memoirs were finally tentatively peered at by the family in the early 19th century, the reaction was one of horror. The first Marquess of Bristol consulted with fellow aristocrats. They read the passages about the king's hemorrhoids, the queen's deathbed, the prince's mistresses. They read the cool, detached analysis of parliamentary corruption. It was too much. It was decided that the manuscript had to be sanitized before it could ever see the light of day. And so the mutilation began. We know today that the manuscript of the memoirs of the reign of George II is incomplete. There are gaps, there are pages torn out, there are sections heavily scored through with thick ink. The most significant gap covers the years of Hervey's most intense relationship with Stephen Fox and the specific details of his own sexual life. The family censors, working with the best of intentions to protect their ancestors' reputation, performed a surgical lobotomy on the text. They wanted to present Hervey the politician, Hervey the historian, but they desperately wanted to kill Hervey the lover, Hervey the sporus. They tried to turn him into a conventional historical figure, stripping away the amphibious nature that made him unique. But the text fought back. Hervey's voice was too strong, his irony too permeating to be completely scrubbed clean. Even in the redacted version, the strangeness of the man shone through. The way he described the male body, the way he analyzed the emotional entanglements of men, the way he dismissed the conventional morality of marriage. It was all there, lurking between the lines. In 1848, over a century after his death, the decision was finally made to publish the memoirs. The editor was John Wilson Croker, a conservative politician and writer. Croker was fascinated by the 18th century, but he was also a man of his time. In his introduction, he felt compelled to apologize for Hervey. He warned the reader about the laxity of the age. He presented Hervey as a specimen of a bygone, slightly barbaric era of aristocracy. The publication hit the Victorian literary world like a thunderclap. Suddenly, the sporus of Pope's poem had a voice, and what a voice it was. Readers were astonished by the modernity of the prose. Hervey didn't write like a dusty chronicler. He wrote like a novelist. He created scenes, he quoted dialogue, he analyzed psychology with Freudian acuity before Freud was born. The Victorians were shocked by the cynicism, by the revelation that the Glorious Revolution and the Hanoverian succession were built on such petty human foundations. But the most profound impact was the resurrection of the man himself. For the first time, people could look past the white lead and the rouge and see the mind at work. They saw the pain. Hervey's descriptions of his own illness, his stoicism in the face of death, gave the lie to the charge of cowardice. A coward does not write with such unflinching honesty. A sycophant does not dismantle the idols he serves with such precision. The effeminate courtier was revealed to be the toughest man in the room, yet the mystery remained. The missing pages, the destroyed letters, the edited journals, the full truth of his relationship with Stephen Fox, and the exact nature of his life in the shadows remained obscured. The Victorians couldn't talk about it. They didn't have the vocabulary or the stomach to discuss what it meant to be a man who loved men in 1730. They classified him as a degenerate genius, a brilliant anomaly. It would take another 100 years and another revolution in how we understand gender and sexuality for the final veil to be lifted. It would take a world that had moved past the binary of man and woman to truly see John Hervey not as a monster, but as a pioneer. But as the 19th century closed, Lord Hervey remained a ghost in the machine of British history, a figure seen out of the corner of the eye, a flash of silk in a dark corridor, a whisper of scandal that refused to be silenced. The body was in the vault at Ickworth, but the spirit was still restless, waiting for the time when the amphibious thing could finally step out of the water and breathe the air of a new world. The story of his resurrection and the modern reclamation of his identity is the final chapter of this long, strange journey. It is the story of how a man destroyed by the 18th century became a hero for the 21st. Thus, for nearly 2 centuries, Hervey remained a prisoner of Victorian morality, a brilliant phantom trapped behind the bars of censorship and prejudice. But time is the ultimate editor. As the world moved out of the rigid shadows of the 19th century and into the fractured psychological complexity of the modern age, the lock on the Hervey archive began to rust. The key to his liberation would not be found in apologetics, but in a radical shift in how we understand the human heart, paving the way for a resurrection that no one in the Georgian era could have predicted. The dawn of the 20th century brought with it the rumble of war and the shattering of old certainties. But in the quiet, dust-moted archives of the British aristocracy, the ghost of John Hervey was patiently waiting. For nearly 200 years, he had been defined by his enemies. He was the Sporus of Pope, the Lord Fanny of the broadsheets, a two-dimensional villain composed of spite and face paint. But history is a patient excavating machine. As the rigid moral structures of the Victorian era began to crumble, and as psychology began to replace theology as the primary way of understanding human behavior, the conditions were finally right for the real John Hervey to emerge from the shadows. The breakthrough came not from Ickworth, but from the archives of the Fox family. While Hervey's own memoirs had been censored and sanitized by his descendants to protect his political reputation, the letters he had sent to Stephen Fox had been preserved at Melbury House, the seat of the Earls of Ilchester. In 1950, the 6th Earl of Ilchester decided to publish these documents. It was a quiet academic event that caused a seismic shift in the understanding of Georgian sexuality. Suddenly, the monster had a voice that was not dripping with political venom, but with raw, unguarded love. When scholars and readers finally laid eyes on the unredacted correspondence between Hervey and Fox, the caricature of the cold-hearted sycophant dissolved. Here was a man writing in 1731, "I have no pleasure but in you, and I am so far from being ashamed of my love for you that I glory in it." This was not the stylized, performative friendship of the Renaissance. This was a desperate, throbbing, emotional dependency. The letters revealed that Hervey's effeminacy was not a pose adopted for fashion, but the external expression of a soul that genuinely did not fit the binary molds of his time. He wrote to Fox about the pain of separation, about the boredom of the court when Fox was away, and about his jealousy. This revelation forced a complete reassessment of Hervey's marriage to Mary Lepel. For centuries, Mary had been pitied as the long-suffering wife of a deviant. The new evidence suggested something far more complex and far more modern. It appeared that Mary was not a victim, but a willing participant in a sophisticated emotional triangle. She knew of her husband's love for Fox. She did not just tolerate it, she facilitated it. In a world where women were property and marriage was a business transaction, the Hervey household emerged as a radical experiment in freedom. They had constructed a chosen family 2 centuries before the term existed. This transformed Hervey from a villain into a pioneer of alternative domesticity, a man who tried to build a life that could contain all his contradictions. Simultaneously, the 20th century brought the tools of modern medicine to the cold case of Hervey's physical suffering. For generations, his fits and his diet had been dismissed as affectations or the results of debauchery. Modern medical historians, analyzing his detailed descriptions of his symptoms, the abdominal spasms, the nervous palsies, the darkening of the urine, the loose teeth, began to construct a diagnosis that exonerated him from the charge of moral weakness. While some theories pointed towards porphyria, the royal disease that maddened George III, the evidence pointed more strongly towards a tragic combination of chronic epilepsy and slow, systematic heavy metal poisoning. The white lead, ceruse, was the culprit. We now know that lead is a neurotoxin. It does not just destroy the body, it attacks the mind. It causes paranoia, anxiety, and tremors. It attacks the digestive system, causing the colic that left Hervey screaming in agony. It destroys the gums. When we look at Hervey's life through this lens, his achievements become staggering. He wasn't a fragile fop who whined about a headache. He was a man operating at the highest levels of government while his body was being slowly liquefied by the very mask he wore to survive. The laudanum he took was not a recreational vice. It was the only thing that allowed him to stand upright. The effeminate weakness was in reality an iron endurance. He was fighting a war against his own biology every single day, painting over the decay and stepping into the ballroom to do battle with the Prince of Wales. This medical and emotional recontextualization coincided with the rise of queer history as a discipline in the late 20th century. Historians were looking for ancestors, for evidence that the LGBTQ+ experience was not a modern invention, but a constant thread in the human tapestry. In Hervey, they found a gold mine. He was not a closeted man living a life of quiet desperation. He was a man who lived his difference in the center of the public eye. He was out in a way that was almost incomprehensible for the 1730s. He did not hide his effeminacy. He accentuated it. He weaponized it. The concept of the third sex, once used as a slur against him, was reclaimed as a badge of honor. Scholars argued that Hervey was performing a deliberate gender disruption. By refusing to be the John Bull Englishman, by rejecting hunting, drinking, and coarse manners, he was engaging in a political act. He was showing that power did not have to look masculine. He was the androgyne of the Enlightenment, a figure who proved that intelligence and political acumen were not sex-linked traits. His relationship with Queen Caroline was reevaluated not as the fawning of a pet, but as a meeting of two brilliant minds who were both trapped by their gender roles. She by the limitations placed on women, he by the limitations placed on men. In each other, they found a mirror. As the 21st century arrived, the cultural rehabilitation of Lord Hervey began to bleed into popular culture. Historical dramas and biographies began to move away from the villain trope. We began to see him as a tragic hero, a man born too soon. But perhaps tragic is the wrong word. Tragedy implies defeat. Hervey was never defeated. He died in office, he secured his family's future, and he left behind a literary masterpiece that outlived all his critics. His memoirs, once locked in a box, are now recognized as one of the greatest political works in the English language, standing alongside the Diaries of Pepys or the works of Saint-Simon. They are studied not just for their scandal, but for their prose. Hervey's writing style, cynical, balanced, antithetical, is the perfect reflection of his mind. He sees both sides of everything because he was both sides of everything. He writes about the court with the detachment of an anthropologist studying a tribe of savages, yet he is one of the savages. This tension gives the work its electric quality. When we read him today, we are not reading a dusty historical document. We are listening to a voice that sounds startlingly like our own, skeptical, weary of spin, and obsessed with the gap between public persona and private truth. But the most haunting aspect of Hervey's modern legacy lies in the question of identity. In an age where we are obsessed with labels, gay, straight, bi, trans, non-binary, Hervey remains elusive. He refuses to stay in any box we try to build for him. Was he gay? He loved his wife and fathered 8 children. Was he bisexual? His emotional intensity was almost entirely directed at men. Was he trans or gender fluid? He lived as a man, fought duels as a man, yet referred to himself and was referred to by others in feminine terms. He essentially forces us to abandon our labels and look at the human being. He reminds us that the past is a foreign country and its inhabitants did not follow our rules. The sporous insult which Pope intended as a curse to banish Hervey from humanity has ironically become his salvation. By calling him amphibious, Pope accidentally captured the source of Hervey's power. Amphibians can survive in 2 worlds. They can breathe water and air. Hervey could breathe the air of the court and the water of the underground. He could speak the language of men and the language of women. He could navigate the world of power and the world of art. This adaptability, this refusal to be fixed, is what makes him so compelling to the modern mind. We are living in an age of fluidity, and Hervey is our ancestor. As we walk through the staterooms of Kensington Palace today, looking at the portraits of George II and Queen Caroline, they seem stiff, frozen in their royal grandeur. But if you look closely at the edges of the frame, you can almost see him. You can see the flash of white velvet, the shimmer of a pearl earring, the knowing smirk of the man who is watching it all, recording it all. The king and queen are history. Lord Hervey is modern. He is the observer who knows that the pageantry is fake, that the actors are flawed, and that the only thing that matters is the truth written in secret ink. His story also serves as a grim warning about the cost of conformity. Hervey paid for his difference with his health and his reputation. The lead poisoning is a potent metaphor for the toxicity of the closet, or the toxicity of trying to fit a mold that doesn't fit you. Ultimately, the lead mask he wore to survive was the very thing that consumed him, a poetic and tragic testament to the price of conformity. It is a story that resonates with anyone who has ever felt the need to hide their true self to survive in a hostile environment. And yet, despite the poison, despite the hatred, despite the pain, he won. He won because we are still talking about him. We are not talking about the Duke of Newcastle. We are not talking about William Pulteney. We are talking about John Hervey. The thing of silk proved to be stronger than iron. The curd of ass's milk proved to be more enduring than marble. He bet on the judgment of posterity, and posterity has finally ruled in his favor. But the story has one final twist, one final layer to peel back. To fully understand the magnitude of Hervey's life, we must look at the what-ifs. We must look at the road not taken and the final lingering mystery of his last days. There are rumors, faint echoes in the archives of a final manuscript, a text even more explosive than the memoirs, a text that was not just censored but destroyed, a text where Hervey finally dropped the third-person narrator and spoke directly. I. What was in that fire? What final confession did the family burn? And what does the silence of the flames tell us about the limits of what history can ever truly know? Yet, even as the modern world brought new light to his story, a dark cloud of smoke still lingered over the archives, the persistent memory of what was lost forever. We have recovered the public man and the private lover, but we are haunted by the phantom limbs of his missing thoughts. To fully grasp the magnitude of the tragedy, we must turn our eyes from the papers that survived to the papers that did not, to the fires that consumed the most intimate confessions of a soul who dared to speak too freely for his time. The smoke that rose from the chimneys of Ickworth House in the years following John Hervey's death was not just the smoke of hearth fires warming a great estate. It was the smoke of history being erased. To understand the final tragic contour of Hervey's existence, we must confront the Great Burning. We know that the memoirs survived, albeit in a mutilated form, locked in their chest. But what of the rest? What of the intimate diaries? What of the thousands of letters that did not concern the dry maneuvers of the Whig Party, but the beating heart of the man himself? Family tradition and the fragmented whispers of archivists suggest that a systematic purge took place. It was an auto-da-fe of the written word. The Hervey family, specifically his son Augustus and later descendants, faced a terrible choice. To keep the papers was to risk the total annihilation of the family's social standing. If the full, unvarnished details of John Hervey's sexual life, his specific physical acts, his most blasphemous thoughts on religion, and his rawest emotional cries had been made public in the 18th or 19th centuries, the earldom of Bristol would have been pariahs, and so they fed the fire. This act of destruction is the final violence committed against John Hervey. First, his body was poisoned by lead, then his reputation was poisoned by Pope, and finally, his voice was choked by the very people who should have protected it. We are left with a silhouette, a shadow puppet play, where we can see the outline of the figure, but not the details of the face. We must ask ourselves, what was in those fires? Did he write about the touch of Stephen Fox's hand with the same precision he used to describe a parliamentary debate? Did he describe the terror of the seizures in a way that would have revolutionized medical understanding? Did he leave behind a manifesto for the third sex that was 200 years ahead of its time? The tragedy is that we will never know. The void where those papers should be is a wound in the side of history. It reminds us that history is not an objective record of what happened. It is a record of what survived. It is a record of what the powerful allowed to exist. Hervey, for all his privilege, was a victim of this editorial tyranny. He was a man whose truth was too dangerous to be preserved. However, the fire could not burn everything. It could not burn the essence of the man, which had already seeped into the groundwater of English culture. As we reach the end of this journey, we must weigh the scales between Alexander Pope and John Hervey. For centuries, it seemed Pope had won. His couplets were memorized by schoolboys. His satire was celebrated as the pinnacle of wit. Hervey was just the footnote, the bug pinned to the page. But look closer at the long arc of time. Pope's world, the world of rigid moral binaries, of absolute certainty of classical order, is a world that has largely vanished. It feels distant, museum-like. Hervey's world, on the other hand, is our world. He lived in a state of constant flux. He navigated a political landscape defined by spin, fake news, and performative outrage. He lived in a body that was chemically altered and medically managed. He lived a sexual identity that defied simple categorization. He was anxious, he was skeptical, and he was fluid. John Hervey is not a relic of the 1730s. He is a prophecy of the 2020s. Pope described a monster. Time revealed a mirror. The amphibious thing turned out to be the prototype for the modern individual, complex, fragmented, and fighting to define a self in a world of surfaces. There is a profound irony in the fact that the lead makeup, intended to create a mask of conformity, became the symbol of his rebellion. He painted his face to hide the decay, to look like a perfect courtier, but by painting it so thickly, so obviously, he drew attention to the artifice. He was walking into the court of the king and saying, "Look at me. Everything here is fake. My face is fake. Your rituals are fake. This power is fake. I am just the only one honest enough to wear the paint on the outside." He was a surrealist performance artist trapped in a Baroque oil painting. Let us return one last time to that dressing room where we began. The candles are burning low now, the wax dripping onto the silver tray. The air is still heavy with the scent of jasmine and sickness. The man at the mirror is tired. The years have been long. He has fought the prince. He has advised the queen. He has loved the man he could not keep. And he has written the words that will be his vengeance. He picks up a cloth. Slowly, deliberately, he begins to wipe away the mask. The white ceruse smears, revealing the pitted gray skin beneath. The red rouge dissolves, leaving the pale, hollow cheeks. The wig is lifted off, revealing the shaved, vulnerable head. The Lord Fanny, the Sporus, the vice-chamberlain, dissolves. What is left is simply John. He looks into the glass. He does not see a monster. He sees a survivor. He sees a man who refused to be crushed by the weight of a world that hated him. He sees the ghost in the mirror, the part of the human spirit that remains indomitable, even when the body is failing and the wolves are at the door. He picks up his pen for the final time. The ink is black and permanent. He writes not for the king, not for the queen, not even for Stephen Fox anymore. He writes for the unknown reader of the future. He writes for us. He dips the quill and scratches across the parchment, his hand trembling slightly from the mercury, but his mind as sharp as a diamond. I have recounted the history of a court, he thinks, but I have lived the history of a heart. They will call me names when I am gone. They will try to silence me, but I have written it down, and ink is more patient than blood. He blows out the candle. The room plunges into darkness. The thing of silk is gone, but in the darkness the words remain. They glow with a radioactive half-life, waiting for the chest to be opened, waiting for the fire to die down, waiting for the world to finally catch up to Lord John Hervey. His story is not just a biography of a dead aristocrat. It is a testament to the price of being different. It is a study in the alchemy of power and pain. It warns us that the masks we wear can poison us, but it also comforts us with the knowledge that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of rising to the surface. The third sex was not an aberration. He was a pioneer. He walked the lonely path so that others could eventually find the road. And as we leave him there, in the silence of the 18th century, we realize that he has been walking alongside us all along. One might think that with this emotional reclamation of his spirit, the story of the Herveys would find its final rest. But John Hervey was merely the first eruption of a volcano that would remain active for generations. The DNA of the third sex, that unique combination of aesthetic brilliance and reckless defiance, did not vanish into the ether with his death. Instead, it reconstituted itself in his children, sparking a new series of scandals that would prove the Hervey madness was far from finished, echoing down the decades to ensure that England could never quite forget the man with the painted face. While John Hervey's body lay cold in the Suffolk earth, the toxic legacy of the Hervey madness, that peculiar blend of brilliance, fragility, and scandal, continued to course through the veins of his progeny. To fully understand the magnitude of Lord Hervey's life, we cannot simply close the book at his death in 1743. We must witness the strange and chaotic aftershocks that shook the Georgian era for another 50 years, proving that the third sex was not a biological dead end, but the progenitor of a dynasty of rebels who would continue to terrorize the norms of British society. The immediate burden of this legacy fell upon the shoulders of his widow, Mary Lapel. History often sidelines the wives of famous men, but Mary was the architect of the Hervey survival. Imagine her situation in the 1740s. She was the widow of the most notorious man in London, a man publicly branded as a catamite and a monster. She was left with limited funds, a pile of debts left by Hervey's extravagant spending on art and clothes, and a house full of children who were already showing signs of the family's erratic temperament. A lesser woman would have collapsed or retreated into a convent-like seclusion. Mary, however, possessed a spine of steel. She understood that the only way to wash away the stain of Sporus was to overwhelm society with charm and intellect. She transformed her home into a fortress of the Enlightenment. She realized that while the English aristocracy might despise sexual deviancy, they idolized French culture and wit. By becoming the most French woman in London, fluent in the language, corresponding with the philosophes, hosting salons that rivaled those of Paris, she created a protective bubble around her children. She raised them not to be ashamed of their father, but to be proud of his intellect, while carefully pruning the more dangerous aspects of his personality. Yet genetics is a stubborn thing. As her sons grew into men, it became clear that the apple had not fallen far from the twisted tree. The most spectacular eruption of the Hervey nature appeared in the scandal of the Duchess of Kingston, a saga that mesmerized London in the 1770s and directly involved John Hervey's second son, Augustus. Augustus Hervey was a naval officer, a man who had inherited his father's sensuality but channeled it into a voracious heterosexual promiscuity that was legendary even by sailor standards. He was the English Casanova, a man who treated marriage with the same casual disdain his father had shown for court etiquette. In a fit of youthful passion, Augustus had secretly married Elizabeth Chudleigh, a woman of blinding beauty and total lack of scruples. They hated each other instantly and separated, keeping the marriage a secret so they could both continue to live as single courtiers. Years passed. Augustus became the third Earl of Bristol. Elizabeth, believing that her secret marriage was invalid, married the Duke of Kingston, becoming one of the wealthiest women in England. When the Duke died and left her his fortune, the Hervey family stepped in. They wanted the money. They revealed the secret marriage. This triggered the trial of the century. In 1776, Elizabeth Chudleigh was tried for bigamy in Westminster Hall. It was a carnival. The peers of the realm donned their robes, tickets were sold on the black market for 50 guineas, and the entire city turned out to watch the Hervey scandal played out again, a generation later. It was a reprise of the Sporus drama, but this time with a female lead. The public saw in Augustus and Elizabeth the same disregard for law, the same arrogance, and the same amphibious morality that had defined Lord John Hervey. The trial confirmed what everyone already suspected. The Herveys were a law unto themselves. They were not bound by the rules that governed ordinary mortals. But it was the fourth son, Frederick Hervey, who became the fourth Earl of Bristol, who truly elevated the family eccentricity to the level of high art. If John Hervey was the ghost, Frederick was the clown prince. He entered the church, eventually becoming the Bishop of Derry, but he was the most unchristian bishop in history. He inherited his father's love for Italy and art, but he lacked his father's melancholic restraint. Frederick spent his life traveling Europe in a blaze of glory. He was so famous for his lavish spending and constant movement that the Hotel Bristol chain, found in cities all over Europe to this day, is named after him. Frederick is the key to understanding the final architectural legacy of John Hervey. Upon returning to the family estate at Ickworth, Frederick decided that the old house was insufficient for a family of such genius. He decided to build a monument. He conceived of the Ickworth Rotunda, a massive circular palace dominated by a giant dome flanked by curving wings. It was a building that looked like nothing else in England. It was Italian, it was classical, it was bizarre, and it was grand. It was in stone and mortar, the physical embodiment of John Hervey's soul, distinct, foreign, intellectual, and refusing to fit into the square boxes of the English countryside. When we walk through the rotunda today, we are walking through the mind of the Herveys. The walls are hung with the portraits of the family, including the famous Van Loo portrait of John Hervey holding the Privy Seal, his face pale, his smile enigmatic. The house is a temple of the winds, a place where the air seems thinner, more rarefied. It stands as a defiance against the beef and pudding dullness of the surrounding squire archy. It is the final victory of the third sex over the landscape of England. Yet amidst the stone and the scandals, the most potent legacy remained the written word. The box containing the memoirs sat in the library of this new rotunda, a time capsule waiting to burst. We must look closely at the moment of its opening in the mid-19th century to understand the shockwave it created. When the family finally allowed John Wilson Croker to edit and publish the papers in 1848, the Victorian era was at its height. This was the age of Dickens, of moral rectitude, of the covered table leg and the stiff upper lip. Into this world of heavy velvet and repressed emotion dropped the voice of John Hervey. The reaction was visceral. William Makepeace Thackeray, the great novelist, reviewed the memoirs and was horrified. He described the court of George II as described by Hervey as a place reeking with corruption, a dance of death. He wrote, "I am frightened as I look at her, Queen Caroline, so brazen and so brightly painted." The Victorians were terrified because Hervey showed them the skull beneath the skin. He showed them that the monarchy they revered was built on a foundation of petty hatreds, digestive problems, and sexual intrigues. He stripped away the divine right of kings and left only the messy humanity of people. But for a small, discerning group of readers, Hervey was a revelation. Writers and artists who felt themselves to be outsiders, the aesthetes of the late 19th century, found a grandfather in him. They saw in his prose a precursor to their own struggles. They recognized the camp sensibility, the use of artifice, exaggeration, and wit to speak the truth. Long before the word camp existed, Hervey became a secret password among the literary elite, a nod to a different way of seeing the world. As we move into the modern era, the scientific analysis of Hervey's life offers one final heartbreaking chapter. Modern toxicology has allowed us to reconstruct the final days of his life with forensic precision. We now know that the colic he suffered was likely lead colic, a pain so intense it is comparable to passing a kidney stone, but continuous. The palsy was the lead attacking his motor neurons. The melancholy was the neurotoxic effect on his brain chemistry. When we read his letters to Stephen Fox, where he complains of being vaporish or low, we are reading the symptoms of a man being poisoned by his own vanity case. This biological tragedy reframes his entire political career. It was not just a struggle for power, it was a struggle for physical transcendence. Every speech he gave in the House of Lords was a victory over a body that wanted to collapse. Every witty retort was a synapse, firing in a brain that was under chemical siege. There is a heroism in this that transcends the moral judgments of the 18th century. It is the heroism of the endurance artist. And what of the missing papers, the burnt letters? This remains the open wound in the story. We can assume, based on the fragments that survived, that Hervey was working on a philosophy of love that was radical. In his few surviving poems and private jottings, he hints at a worldview where the soul has no gender. He writes of a union of minds that supersedes the friction of bodies. It is likely that the destroyed papers contained a defense of homosexual love that would have placed him alongside Plato or Oscar Wilde. The smoke of that burning chest robbed us of a manifesto, but perhaps the silence is its own kind of speech. The gap in the archive forces us to fill it with our own imagination, to project our own understanding onto the blank screen of his life. So, how does the story truly end? It ends with a mirror, not the silver-rimmed mirror in St. James's Palace, but the mirror of history. For 300 years, society has looked at John Hervey and seen what it wanted to see. The 18th century saw a monster. The 19th century saw a warning. The 20th century saw a patient. The 21st century sees a pioneer. He stands there at the intersection of all these gazes, looking back at us with that faint painted smile. He reminds us that identity is a performance, that history is a fiction written by the survivors, and that sometimes the most fragile people are the ones who leave the deepest marks. He is the amphibious thing who learned to breathe in the vacuum of history. He is the man who painted his face to hide from the world, and in doing so, made himself visible forever. As the lights go out in the gallery at Ickworth, and the tourists go home, the eyes of the portrait seem to gleam in the twilight. The lead is gone, the pain is gone, the politics are dust. All that remains is the triumph of the individual spirit against the crushing weight of the norm.